Good afternoon, Chris.
Good afternoon, Ahenya.
How are you doing today?
I am very well, but I'm feeling in the mood for a murder.
That's a great news because we actually have a very interesting murder in our hands today. So, welcome to A History of Evil Men, Episode 2, Heavenly Creatures. The case that we are going to unfold today is the Parker home murder case, which took place in Christchurch the 22nd of June of 1954. So our protagonist, or maybe the antagonist, are two teenage girls, Pauline Yvonne Parker and Juliet Marion Hume, which came from very different backgrounds, yet somehow found a way to bond with each other. Pauline Parker, aka Pauline Reaper, was born the 26th of May of 1938. She was born in New Zealand in a working-class family. Meanwhile, Juliet Hume was born the 28th of October of 1938 in London, United Kingdom. The girls met in the Christchurch Girls' High School when they were roughly 13 years old. And, Juliet came from an upper-class family. Her father was Henry Hume, a British scientist and physicist who took part in the project of the British atomic bomb, and she was the daughter of Hilda Hume, who was a counselor and a socialite at that time. Both girls met in the early teens and they bonded over the fact that they both had suffered from various illnesses when they were very young. Pauline Parker was diagnosed with osteomyelitis, which is a bone infection, when she was approximately 6 years old, and she got to go under some surgeries in her leg, which left her with chronic pain. Meanwhile, Juliet suffered from bronchitis and tuberculosis also when she was very young. And in two different occasions, she was sent by her family to South Africa and Latin America because they believed that the warm weather would be better for her recovery. Also, when she was 2 years old, she was in London during the London Blitz, which was the bombing of London by the Nazis. And according to the sources, she suffered from nightmares and panic attacks. This case became the inspiration of the basis for the 1994 movie by Peter Jackson, Heavenly Creatures. Well, the movie takes as the source for its story the diaries that Pauline Parker kept during 1953 and 1954, which we are going to use also as the sources. Nowadays, you don't get access to the full diaries, but we can get to the trial transcripts of themselves because they've been lost.
The diaries themselves, if they haven't completely decayed over time, have still been kept under lock and key by the New Zealand government as evidence and are only usually ever allowed to be viewed under very specific, strict circumstances. So actually getting a hold of the material from the source is pretty much nigh on impossible.
So the families were initially very happy about the friendship. They were both very imaginative. They were very interested in arts, literature. Pauline was said to have an interest in clay, sculpting. And they quickly managed to
develop a very close, personable friendship with each other, which soon became very close and obsessive, one might say.
Both of the girls were, by the standard of the area, very smart and very intelligent and very imaginative. When we read the transcripts of the diary of Pauline Parker, we can say that they had a very high idea of themselves and that they really thought that they were special and somehow above other people. March the 18th of 1953, Pauline would write, quote, "We have decided how sad it is for other people that they cannot appreciate our genius. But we hope the book will help them to do so a little, so no one could fully appreciate us. The girls imagine a whole series of medieval fantasy world that they were writing, both of them, and later on both of the girls would take as alternative identities of people that live in that world. It is said that by Mrs. Hume, Hilde Hume, the mother of Juliet, that sometimes the girls would get so much in the character when they were doing this role play that it was actually hard to get Juliet out of the character because she was so deep into it.
With many of the characters, the girls had fleshed out their histories, their motivations, their desires, as well as the complicated relationships that these characters had with each other and their families going back several generations and forward several generations as well. Not to mention the history and the politics of the imagined country.
It's also said that the story was also full of some violence. There was war and kidnap and vendettas, and it was really impressive for the adult people that would read what they were writing. But there was something else apart from the kingdom of Borovnia that was this fictional world. There was the fourth world that was literally a different reality in which the girls, Pauline and Juliet, could actually have access. On April the 3rd of 1953, Pauline wrote on her diary, quote, "Today, Juliet and I found the key to the fourth world. We realize now that we have had it in our possession for about 6 months, but we only realized it on the day of the death of Christ. We saw a gateway through the clouds. We stand on the edge of the path and looked down the hill out over the bay. The island looked beautiful. The sea was blue. Everything was full of peace and bliss. We then realized we had the key. We now know that we are not genie as we thought. We have an extra part of our brain which can appreciate the fourth world. Only about 10 people have it. When we die, we will go to the fourth world. But meanwhile, on 2 days every year, we may use the key and look into that beautiful world which we have been lacking enough to be allowed to know of, on this day of finding the key to the way through the clouds." So, upon socializing and hanging around the Holmes family, we see that Pauline really, her main bond was to Juliet, but she really seemed to idolize both of her parents. She would call them heavenly people, and on her diary she would write that Mrs. Hume, Hilde, would call her her foster daughter. But on May the 15th, 1953, Juliet was once again diagnosed with tuberculosis on one lung. About that, Pauline wrote, quote, "Mrs. Hume told me today they had found out that Juliet has tuberculosis on one lung. Poor Julieta. It is only now I realize how fond I am of her. I nearly fainted when I heard. I had a terrible job not to cry. It would be wonderful if I could get tuberculosis too." End of quote. We see that what seemed to be a close relationship was slowly developing in a very dependent, dare I say, relationship between the two girls. On the next day, Pauline wrote, "I spent a wretched night. It was a relief to see Juliet looking so well. We agree it was a great pity I had not tuberculosis too, and it would be wonderful if I could catch it. We would be in the sanitarium together and would be able to write a lot. We have decided we are the most incredible optimists." End of quote. So Pauline came out with the idea that she and Juliet would exchange letters while faking or pretending to be the characters of the story of the Kingdom of Borovnia. Pauline would take the place of Charles II, the King of Borovnia, while Juliet would play as Deborah, his mistress, while she was on the sanitarium. Pauline and Juliet came from different backgrounds. Pauline came from a working class family. Her father would run a fish and chips business, and her mother would rent rooms in her house as a boarding house for young students that were going to, I'm guessing, the Polytechnic of University. It's that way that she gets to know a young boy or a young man, because he was older than her, a young man called John, that she had a very brief romance. And this becomes significant in the story because her father found her once in bed with this boy. The young man was thrown away of the house, and they started to have a more of a discipline treatment towards her because she was a young girl and she wasn't married to this guy. So I'm guessing it was quite a scandal. According to what she writes on her diary, it was a terrible tragedy about the way that her family just took the whole issue. But on September, Juliet came out of the tuberculosis sanitarium, and Pauline writes, the 9th of September, quote, "It was wonderful returning with Juliet. It was as if she had never been away. I believe I could fall in love with Juliet."
It should also be noted that following her parents' discovery of her relationship with Nicholas, that they really clamped down on her social activities, and she was essentially grounded and housebound when not at school, and was expected to contribute to the upkeep of the boarding house under the very, very close scrutiny of her mother. It's during this time that Pauline really starts to note her descent into depression and heightened anxiety before going any further.
On November the 2nd of 1953, Pauline wrote, quote, "Today I feel thoroughly, utterly and completely depressed. I was in one of these moods in which committing suicide sounds heavenly." Close quote. If the families were initially happy to see how good they have bonded and how close they had become, they were slowly getting worried about how dependent their relationship was. Basically, because of what? They suspected that the girls might have had a sexual or romantic relationship. On December, Parkers take Pauline to a doctor, Dr. Bennett, which was recommended by the Holmes, and after that visit, Pauline would write that Dr. Bennett was a bloody fool, and it was this doctor the first one to diagnose, quote unquote, that the girls were in a homosexual relationship. And I said diagnosed, quote unquote, because homosexuality was actually considered a mental illness, and sex between men was actually considered a crime in New Zealand, for which you could be sent to prison and even be physically punished.
I should also say that homosexuality was considered a moral failing and reflected particularly badly on the upbringing of the children.
But the real cause of the cause of why Pauline's parents sent him to the doctor was because she was losing weight. Afterwards, when we read or even listening to an interview done to Juliet being older, we discovered that Pauline was actually suffering from bulimia. She was throwing up every meal and she was losing weight. So it came a point in which Pauline's mother, Honora, would even forbid her to see the Hulme family, Juliet and also the Hulmes, unless she would put on some weight. So on December the 20th of 1953, Pauline wrote, quote, "Mother woke me this morning and started lecturing me before I was properly awake. She has brought up the worst possible threat now. She said that if my health did not improve, I could never see the Hun.